J. Pierpont Morgan saves Wall Street. Early in October 1907, John Pierpont Morgan, one of the most remarkable financiers the world has known, spent much of his time playing solitaire in the library of his New York mansion. The semi-retired multi-millionaire was then 71 years old and oblivious to current financial affairs, which he had not bothered to follow during a recent vacation in Europe. Then overnight the bottom fell out of Wall Street. Bankers, brokers, and even the Secretary of the Treasury were powerless as the United States plunged towards economic chaos. In desperation, the men who controlled the nation's financial destiny turned to the hard, bitter old man and begged him to take up his former position as the country's economic dictator. And old Jack Morgan put aside his cards and, by the fantastic manipulation of hundreds of millions of dollars by threats and by sheer force of his overwhelming personality, placed the United States back on an even keel within a fortnight. What J.P. Morgan did during those crucial days is still regarded as one of the most brilliant examples of high finance juggling ever known. The 1907 bank crash was not entirely unexpected. Indications that times would be tough first appeared in June, when the public loans could not be filled and it became apparent farm crops would mature late. Farmers began seeking credit to tide them over, but money was hard to raise. Finance experts could see what was in the wind when one public concern tried to float a loan of $100 million but could raise only a few millions. While portents were ominous, no one expected the debacle that came in early October. It began when Frederick A. Hines, the copper magnate, who owned mines in the Butte, Montana region, failed. His personal failure would have meant nothing had it not been for rumours that he controlled a number of banks which would be involved in his personal collapse. Immediately depositors began overwhelming the Hines banks, drawing out every dollar in their names. Within hours, millions of dollars were being secreted away in safe deposit boxes, under lowboys, or hidden in backyard gardens. Soon the localised panic became an epidemic. Every bank in New York was mobbed by frightened depositors. The drain on the institution's cash reserves was tremendous, but at least the banks did carry enough reserves. The trust companies were the first to crack under the strain. Largely created by J.P. Morgan himself, trust companies were a new type of financial institution. Not required by law to carry large cash reserves like banks, they were able to invest most of their deposits on long terms and thus pay higher interest rates. On October 21st, the Knickerbocker Trust Company, which carried deposits of more than $6 million, was in trouble. Long queues outside the company's main office and the rapidly dwindling reserves panicked the president. He called on Morgan. As usual, the old millionaire was playing solitaire. Putting aside his cards, he listened to the Knickerbocker president's explanation of a situation that had developed while he was in Europe. Yet half an hour later, Morgan not only understood the disease, but knew what the remedy must be. He called a meeting of the city's top banking and trust executives. For hours on end he quizzed them, trying to find out if the Knickerbocker Trust was worth helping. When finally he decided it was not, he announced it would just have to collapse. And the next day, after paying out all of the $8 million it held as liquid reserves, the trust closed its doors. That action at once caused the public to lose confidence in every bank and trust company in New York. The rush to withdraw deposits reached catastrophic proportions. Seeing disaster facing the nation's financial structure, Morgan urgently contracted the Secretary of the Treasury, George Cortelyou, in Washington. The financier asked him to come to New York for consultations. An hour after Cortelyou arrived, he and Morgan were closeted with a number of bankers in a private room at the Manhattan Hotel. At Morgan's instigation, the Secretary of the Treasury agreed to put a substantial amount of government cash into the banks. This would then be held in reserve to meet the unusual demand by depositors. Early on October 23rd, huge queues formed outside the doors of every New York bank and trust company. It didn't need an expert to realise that these institutions were in for a frightening day. Extra tellers were put on as panicking mobs crowded the footpaths and filled the lobbies. Police rushed in to try to get some order out of the chaos. By noon, the Trust of America had doled out most of the $11 million it held. Harassed officials tried to liquidate the company's assets, but no one was interested in lending money to a company obviously on the verge of collapse. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan was wrestling with the problem. As he put a team of accountants to work studying the Trust of America's books, the Trust's president, Oakley Thorne, was on his way to tell the financial wizard he must have help. Morgan did not waste time. He called representatives of all the trust and banking companies together. Then he told the executives they must pool their resources to help the Trust of America, but they would have none of that. As Morgan threatened the frightened trust executives with all kinds of financial retributions, bulletins from Thorne were being handed to him. At 1 p.m, the trust held $1,200,000 in reserve. 20 minutes later, it held $800,000. By 2:15, only $180,000 was between it and bankruptcy. As this last bulletin came in, Morgan's accountants handed him their report. The Trust of America was financially sound. Turning from the jittery trust officials, Morgan browbeat two huge banking concerns into raising enough cash to carry the Trust of America until closing time at 3 p.m. Morgan stayed up all night, unleashing more threats against the remaining trust companies. He let them leave his rooms only when they had promised to help the Trust of America next day. Before retiring to bed, the old man had one more duty. He contacted Cortelyou and persuaded him to put more government money into the banks, which then could legally be lent to the Trust of America. When Morgan arrived at his office early on the morning of October 24th, it was packed with scared bankers. Payments to depositors by the Trust of America, he was told, had not stopped the panic. Depositors were now besieging the Lincoln Trust Company. Worse still, the stock exchange, with falling stock values and no one willing to lend money, was in difficulties. Morgan was told that if unlimited failures were to be avoided, the exchange must close. All the exchange president received for this suggestion was a blast from the tycoon. The exchange must never close, Morgan decreed. Instead, he called the bankers to another meeting and told them flatly that they must raise $25 million before the crucial moment that afternoon when accounts were adjusted at the exchange. He had the money with a 10-minute margin. But Morgan was worried. The run on the trust companies continued, and the millions that had been poured into them was rapidly dwindling. The following day, desperate men haunted Morgan's office. The exchange was again in trouble, so the financier used his power to the full. He told the big bear operators that if they tried to break prices, I will crush you. Having quietened the exchange element that tried to take advantage of the situation, he called on the bankers for another $15 million. He could collect only $13 million, but it was enough to keep the exchange operating. On Saturday, Morgan and Cortelyou left New York mainly to give the impression the situation was in hand and they could afford to relax. By Monday, the position on the exchange had eased, but the trust companies continued to take the full brunt of the panic. Thousands of people, many carrying their lunch boxes, thronged the city streets waiting to face the tellers' grills. They withdrew deposits by the millions. Within a few hours, some companies had almost exhausted their financial resources beyond recovery. The Lincoln Trust decided to close its doors until a vitriolic blast from Morgan changed the directors' minds. But he could do nothing about the Trust's new policy of handing out money as slowly as possible. The situation seemed to be completely out of hand when the city government ran out of cash. Morgan personally underwrote a $30 million loan to the government at 6%. Meanwhile, Morgan's accountants had brought in their latest report on the Lincoln Trust. It was sound, but under the panic conditions could not liquidate its assets to meet the depositors' demands. Then, when Morgan thought he could see victory ahead, another bombshell burst. An independent steel company, which was controlled by one of America's biggest stockbrokers, collapsed. An independent steel company, which was controlled by one of America's biggest stockbrokers, collapsed. As most believed erroneously that the stockbrokers' exchange business was tied up with his bankrupt company, The exchange was again threatened. But Morgan was equal to the task. He arranged for the mammoth United Steel Corporation, which he controlled, to buy the broker's tottering company, thus imparting to it some of United Steel's great financial strength. November 2nd was election day and a bank holiday. It gave Morgan breathing space to raise a $20 million loan from the combined trust companies to bolster the Lincoln and American Trust's cash reserves. Next day, the stock exchange showed a marked buoyancy, and while the queues outside the banks and trust companies continued as long as ever, the organisations paid out with an exhilaration created by confidence. And that day, a huge gold shipment arrived from Europe. The Lusitania was also expected with another shipment, and the panic was over. So John Pierpont Morgan returned to his solitaire.